Welcome to the 1723 podcast with me, your host, Shaun Butler. Now, today we're taking a look at Freemasonry and the Royal Family, in particular in relation to the period around the publishing of the 1723 constitutions. Now, James Stuart, the exiled pretender to the English, Scottish and Irish thrones, and his supporters, including France and Spain, were considered one of the most substantial, if not existential, threats to Hanoverian Britain. The constitutional foundations on which George I, the Elector of Hanover, had been crowned King of Britain and Ireland in 1714, were viewed by many as unsafe. And George I made a delicate situation worse by dismissing the Tories from government and power the following year, alienating a large political segment. Now, to help us find out more about Freemasonry and the Royal Family and its connection to 1723, we are joined by none other than 2022 Prestonian Lecturer Dr. John Hawkins. John is an independent researcher and author with interests in art, family, local, Masonic, military and social history, having published in most of these areas and others. John's Prestonian lecture, The Royal Family and Freemasonry, is available to buy in the shop at Freemasons Hall and on its website. John, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure to be here.
Great pleasure to have you. Now, let's get cracking straight away with a really simple, straightforward opening question. Was there any connection between the English Royal Family and Freemasonry when the first edition of Anderson's Constitutions were published in 1723?
Well, somewhat embarrassingly, the simple answer is no, not to the best of our knowledge. But it is pretty clear that the founders of Premier Grand Lodge had every intention of establishing a connection with royalty as swiftly as possible. Yeah. And in this they were successful.
Okay, and how did that come about?
Well, the key document here is not the first edition of Anderson's Constitutions, which was published in 1723, but the second edition, which was published in 1738. The first edition had included a fantastical account of the history of Freemasonry, which Anderson put together from historical sources and some mythical sources, and he referred to Freemasonry as the royal art. But this history, he wrote, stopped short of a foundation of Premier Grand Lodge, which is normally taken to be in 1717.
Sure.
The second edition brought the history up to date and also included an account of the first meeting of the people who formed Grand Lodge at the Apple Tree Tavern. And those present agreed to choose a Grand Master from among themselves for the time being, but only until such times as they would have the honour of what they called a noble brother at their head.
All right.
And although they actually used the word noble rather than royal, it was pretty clear that their ultimate hope was to have a royal Grand Master, and they made some progress quite quickly. John, the second Duke of Montagu, was made Grand Master only 4 years later in 1721, and by this time the publication of the second edition had their first royal initiate, to whom this edition was dedicated.
And who was that royal initiate?
Well, this was the Prince of Wales, His Royal Highness Frederick Lewis, the eldest son of King George II. He was born and brought up in Hanover and didn't come to England until 1727, by which time he was 20 years old. 10 years after this, he was initiated and passed at what they called an occasional lodge held at his own palace in Kew in Surrey. And this lodge was presided over a former Grand Master of the Order, John Desaguliers. When the second edition of the Constitution was published the following year, it contained a dedication to the recently admitted Prince of Wales, describing him as a Master Mason and a Master of a Lodge. And by then it was also well known to the public that his wife, the Princess of Wales, was pregnant with their second child. An additional stanza was added to the Deputy Grand Master's song. In those days, the constitutions included a number of songs dedicated to various officers. And published in this edition, there was a song that included the verse that the child to this couple should be a Lewis, a Masonic child, whom the world shall admire.
Actually, we're going to do a separate podcast on Masonic songs, so that would be quite interesting to hear more about that. Did Frederick pass on his interest in Freemasonry within his family at all?
Yes, very much so, he did. One of his younger brothers was initiated, and 3 of his children were as well, although not his eldest son, who would in due course become King George III. His youngest son, the Duke of Cumberland, became the first Royal Grand Master in 1782 and served until his death in 1790. And in due course, 6 of George III's sons would become Freemasons. Oh. 2 serving as Grand Masters of Premier Grand Lodge. This was the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Sussex. And 1 as Grand Master of the Ancients Grand Lodge, the Duke of Kent.
So now we have that royal connection established. It's set there. It does seem to have progressed reasonably quickly. And why don't you think this didn't happen before the 1730s? What was the issue?
Well, it goes back to a point I think you alluded to in your introduction. It was almost certainly because of the upbringing of King George I and King George II and Frederick Lewis, the Prince of Wales, in Hanover, now part of Germany, of course. Although Masonic lodges working various degrees existed on the continent, some of them connected with the Stuart cause, the first recorded lodge in Hanover itself wasn't constituted until quite a lot later in 1746. Right. These people simply would not have been brought up in an environment where membership of a Masonic lodge was commonplace. George I, don't forget, was already 54 years old when he came to England in 1714, at which time he ascended the throne, and he continued to spend a lot of time on the continent each year. It really seems to have been a matter of opportunity and other priorities, and it wasn't, in fact, until much later, 1828, that the Grand Lodge of the Kingdom of Hanover was founded, with another Duke of Cumberland, a son of George III, as its first Grand Master. He succeeded to the throne of Hanover because on the death of George IV in 1837, Victoria couldn't become the ruler of Hanover under their version of Salic law. And so he became the King of Hanover as King Ernest I.
So I touched on him briefly in my introduction because he is, an important figure to the context of the story. Was James Stewart, the Young Pretender, was he a Freemason?
Well, this is a very interesting question. And again, the simple answer is that we don't have written evidence one way or the other. There for a long time has been a tradition that he was made a Freemasonry in either France or in Scotland, and that he was made a Knight Templar Mason.
Oh, really?
And there are various references to this in various publications. However, many of these references seem to have been politically aligned rather than genuinely Masonically or historically aligned. And the simple answer is that we don't know for certain. No. But if you travel in Scotland and visit Masonic lodges, they will all often give you a nod and a wink to the fact that
really?
James Stewart was a Freemason. But I think that's more in hope than knowledge.
Oh, fine, right, okie dokie. John, listen, thank you very much for taking the time to come and speak to us today. Obviously, a fascinating topic. Always something that's popular with our listeners, as we saw from your recent Solomon Live talk, which obviously can be viewed on the UGLE YouTube channels. For those listening, just a reminder, make sure that you subscribe to our podcast. Make sure that you are following UGLE on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all those usual channels to keep abreast of the developments as we celebrate the tercentenary of the publishing of the 1723 constitutions. We will be back very soon with another fascinating look into this story, and we look forward to seeing you then. Goodbye.